All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Monday, November 10th, year of our Lord 2025, and today we are going to continue our conversation a little bit about money. So let's begin. All right. Well, I hope you had a good weekend and a good Lord's Day and everything like that. I definitely did. We had a good weekend. We hung out. Didn't really do a whole lot around the house, although we did do a little bit. But it was a nice, restful weekend for the first time in a while, so that was good. And then yesterday, we had church, and we hung out with some church people afterwards. It was all in all a very, very good and delicious day. So there's that. But yesterday, I did see this post here from Andrew Torba. Andrew Torba, of course, is the founder of Gab, the haven for anti-Semites, of course. But anyway, Andrew Torba was commenting on the Trump idea of the 50-year mortgage. You have a mortgage for 50 years so that, the payments are a little less, a little more affordable for you. But obviously, the obvious drawback is that it takes a very long time to get equity in the house. You know what I mean? A very long time. And people are commenting about all the interest that you would pay in a 50-year loan. And the thing is, I do see some people supporting this as well. And, of course, the argument is, the currency is being debased. And so you borrow the money at a fixed rate for 50 years. And mathematically, you're going to win because, you pay, you pay interest. But also the money you borrow is worth less. And the money you pay it back with is worth less than it was when you first borrowed it, kind of thing. And so mathematically, if you run the numbers, you'll be all right, especially if you invest the savings on the mortgage. And that's true. I mean, obviously, certain people will be able to take advantage of a 50-year mortgage. That's very true. But just because the math works, right, doesn't mean it's actually a good idea for most people. You know what I mean? Math is it's abstract, you know what I mean? Like, you can do equations, but the equations have to comport with most people's reality in order to have meaning, right? So, mathematically, yeah, of course, people will use these 50-year mortgages and end up on top. But the truth is, for most people, this is a terrible idea and will, you'll be a permanent debt slave forever, that kind of thing. And so, I understand the people that are talking about the math behind it, but, in reality, most people are just going to become slaves for the rest of their lives, multi-generationally almost. I mean, 50 years is a long time, and not quite generational, but just about. Or maybe it is. I don't know. I don't know if the actual definition, numbers-wise would be of a generation. But, yeah, I mean, it's a long time. It's a long time. So here's Andrew Torba, and what he says is this. He says, buy now, pay later loans for dominoes, 50-year mortgages, 10-year car loans. I almost have a brain aneurysm just reading it. 10-year car loans, 20-plus years paying student loans, 23% average credit card interest rate, 25% of your income taxed and sent to Israel or handed to a third world invader, $315,000 median cost of a house. Debased currency that gets printed from thin air. Something has got to give. That's what he said. Something has got to give. And I commented, I said that my belief is that God enforces Jubilee one way or the other. Either we put a stop to usury or he does. But his way involves a lot of pain. We may already be there. Something will give. And this is my belief. I think if you look at the Old Testament and the Jubilee laws that they had, the whole idea was that nobody would become a permanent underclass, a permanent debt slave in Israel. God's people weren't going to do that to each other. And that was the whole point, so that every Jubilee year, everything kind of reset, and, no one was a permanent generational, multi-generational underclass for forever. Now, I'm not going to explain Jubilee right now, but if you have never heard of Jubilee, you should definitely read some Old Testament, and obviously, I obviously recommend R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North. Gary North has a great book called Honest Money where he goes into a lot of this stuff. but it gives you a really good kind of summary statement about what the Jubilee was all about and, why God implemented it and all that kind of thing. Now, if you are unaware, the people of Israel didn't always do what God wanted them to do, right? They did not follow the law that well. And there were times where God comes in judgment against Israel because they refused to enforce the Jubilee laws. They were trying to take advantage of their poorer brothers, and they weren't releasing debts, and they weren't reverting the lands back to the original owners. They weren't doing the Jubilee law. And so God highlights that and says, hey, this is why I'm coming in judgment, right? I'm coming in judgment for these reasons, and this is what I'm going to do. That's God enforcing the Jubilee, even though the people of Israel weren't. So they were ignoring the Jubilee. They think they can get one over on God. But God is like, no, you can't get one over on me. I understand that you can choose to do my law or not, but I'm going to enforce it one way or the other. His way involves a lot of pain. And I think that these principles that we can draw from the specific law that God gave Israel, they very clearly apply to every nation, at least in principle, right? Maybe not the letter of the law, but the principles of having this situation that is untenable, where there's a certain class of people that is just permanently in debt slavery forever. There's no way out. God doesn't like that, to say the least. It's not what he prefers. And the thing about God is that he gets what he prefers, right? And he's going to do it one way or another. Now, all of the stuff that Andrew talks about here, these are all, some of them are innovative, some of them, but they're all just different forms of debt, right? And I thought that there was a guy here above my pay grade here. I don't know who this is, but he put a really nice point on it. He says, in my opinion, it all comes down to the currency. All of those are downstream consequences. They're there because we have a debt-based monetary system that cannot handle prices dropping. That's what he says. And I think he's totally right. I think he's totally right. The fact it all comes down, it starts with the money, right? Because when you have a fiat money that's based on debt, and the system is designed so that you have to debase the currency over time. The prices have to go up over time. That's how that's the foundation of your economy, right? You don't have honest money, right? Because when you have honest money, and it's like, it's a hard money kind of situation. Like I prefer gold and silver, things like that. It keeps governments honest, right? Because they can only issue so much currency as they have gold to back it up, or they can also issue debt, but they're still like they get debt in a much more responsible way, right? Like they can't go too crazy with it, right? Because it would be more like it would be more like you borrowing money, right? You could only borrow so much money, as an individual, right? But the government can borrow unlimited money, right? Basically, unlimited money because of how the currency is issued, or there's really no limits to it, right? I mean, there's theoretical limits, but really there's no limits, right? So this system that we have, the money that we use, this stuff, the dollar bills here, it's baked into the cake that the value of this has to go down, right? And the way our system is especially insidious, right? Because you've heard about like trickle down economics, right? And I understand that there is some truth to trickle down economics, but it's actually pretty insidious because the people that have the first access to easy credit, right? When they cutting the interest rates and making credit easier and stuff like that. The people that have the first access to it are the richer people, the people that own assets, right? The people that are productive. And they've got access to the easy credit. And it does eventually get to the individuals, to people like you and me. Like that money does eventually trickle down, in a manner of speaking. But by the time it gets to us, it's worth a lot less than it was when it gets in the hands of the very wealthy, the people that have a lot of assets, the people that own a lot of assets and purchase more assets. when they get the easy credit, it was worth more. But by the time you get it, it's not worth as much as it was when they got it. And so what ends up happening is you have this increased separation of the haves and the have-nots, right? The haves and the have-nots. You got the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And that is a feature of the system, right? And I don't blame this on capitalism necessarily, right? But I do understand the critiques of capitalism, and they're kind of almost right. But because we don't have actually hard money, we don't actually have real money as our money, we have this debt issuance, it gets all mixed up, right? So any economy that's using fiat money, it's too tempting to just issue more and more and more and more of it. It's too tempting because it gives the government a lot of power to be able to do this, to be able to get a lot of print a lot of money and give it out to whoever they want, and that it gives them a lot of power and a lot of authority. And if they were limited by the amount of gold that they held, that would actually be limiting their own power. They're never going to do that. That's not in their nature, right? They don't want hard money because it limits their power, it limits their authority. And so it's not really capitalism that they're criticizing. It's this perversion of capitalism that they're criticizing. Now, I understand that the terms are kind of used interchangeably, and I don't really have too much of a problem with that. Now, ultimately, I am a capitalist, but I'm not going to argue too much with people that are criticizing capitalism as it exists today. I'm not really going to argue too much with them because I would argue with the same things. I think that it's a perversion, right? So I'm not going to really defend these cronies, but there you go. So anyway, that's how this works. Like the trickle down economics, yeah, there's some truth to it to some degree, but the value that the top is getting from the easy credit, by the time it trickles down to you, it's been eroded of a lot of that value. And so, yeah, you do get it, but you're not getting the maximum oomph that those that own a lot of assets are getting. And that's a feature of the system. That's just is what it is. You know what I mean? And obviously, I don't think it should be that way, but that's how it is, right? That is how it is. And so as an individual who, I do okay financially, I've got a good net worth and all of this kind of stuff. And so I know where I stand, right? As an individual, I have to understand the game that I'm playing, right? And so I need to do things with my money that are going to put me in the most advantageous situation that I could possibly be in. And what does that look like for someone like me? Well, that means cutting my expenses a lot. I don't live at the level that you might expect me to live given my financial situation, right? Because I want to save as much money as I can, but I don't just want to save it like this, because if I save it like this, I'm screwing myself, right? Because this stuff is going down in value. That's the worst kind of saving I can imagine. Imagine saying, why don't you save your money so that by the time, you use it, it's worth a couple percentage points of what it was when you saved it. That's a terrible proposition, right? So I want to save it and I want to buy assets with it, right? Whatever that might be. Some people like dividend-paying stocks or whatever. Some people like gold. Some people like Bitcoin. Some people like a mix of it. I mean, it just depends on what you want to do, right? And so that's you have to think through how am I going to cut my expenses to the bone and acquire as many assets as I can that pay me with the money. I want to put my money to work as much as possible. But see, the thing is though, that over time, as prices go up and up and up and up, the cost of living goes up and up and up with the prices, obviously. And the people at the bottom of the trickle-down economics, their wages don't increase quite as much to keep up with that. And so a bigger chunk of their disposable income is not disposable anymore. They gotta spend it on food and housing and cars and stuff like that. And again, there's a lot of mistakes made along the way, right? Like, they don't necessarily need to spend it on the kind of cars that they actually do get. They could buy a cheaper car if they wanted to, but a lot of people don't do that. But even if you do that, a bigger chunk of your money is going to just living, right? And it gets so bad that the cost of living rises so much that that what ends up happening is that there's a bigger percentage of people that need to borrow money just for basic things like housing. It's a basic thing. and you need to borrow money. Pretty much everybody needs to borrow money in order to acquire a house because the prices have gone so high, right? People are borrowing money to buy food. People are borrowing money to buy cars. I know probably some of you guys have done that, right? Even I've done that. Now, I have 2 cars, and one of the cars that we have, I did borrow a little bit of money to get. And the only reason I did that is because I was just a little bit unsure about my income situation in the future. So I didn't want to necessarily put all of that cash into the car. But, it was just a little bit of money that I borrowed. And then the other car that I bought, I paid for in cash. You know what I mean? But I'm a pretty blessed guy in that way that I was able to do that. Now, here's the thing. Like, when you have a situation where things are so expensive that you essentially need to borrow just to live, more and more people are doing that. Eventually, you've got to come to the place where you think, maybe the whole system's usury, right? Because if it's a feature of the system that we're currently under, that things get more and more expensive, but by the time the lower classes get the money, they still don't have enough to keep up with how expensive things are getting. The richer people, the middle class, are bidding up prices so much that they end up having to do buy now, pay later for their groceries. That's a situation where you're in debt all the time, forever, basically, just to live. And it's because of the fiat money that you're in that situation. You've got a situation where credit almost becomes a form of usury, right? Credit, used to be optional, but now for a lot of people, it's essential, right? And it's not a matter of a voluntary situation. No, you actually have to go into debt in order to survive. I'm not saying everybody's in that situation, because some people could cut back their lifestyle and not go into debt, right? People don't want to do that, but they theoretically could. But we're approaching a situation where that's actually not the case with some people. They actually have to go into debt. It's not a voluntary situation anymore. They have to go into debt just to buy groceries for the week. That's an extraction. That's an extraction from rich people. I'm from poor people to rich people. And, R.J. Rushdoony, I think, I think it was in his Institutes where he talks about this as it's almost like an institutional usury system. Modern banking and fiat currency it makes possible just a whole system of usury where lots of men are debtors to money creators, to the people that own assets, and they're just always going to be in debt. They have to in order to survive. That fiat money debasement, dollar debasement, makes that absolutely necessity for people. And so, yeah, it tends to this kind of stuff, like the debasement of our money is forcing people into slavery, forcing people into debt slavery. Now, we can all find people that we know for a fact are living above their means, and if they just cut back, they'd be fine. I'm not talking about those people, but there are people out there that is not the case, and they are forced into a perpetual debt system. And the idea of a 50-year mortgage, sure, some people will take advantage of that and make money, but a lot of people, and the reason why they're floating this, is a lot of people have no choice but to tie themselves to a debt for 50 years in order to purchase a house. Now, I would argue if that's your situation, you probably shouldn't purchase a house. You should probably rent. That would be my situation. If I had to do that, I'd probably rent. But you can see how this, depending on where you are on the spectrum, if you're one of these asset owners, yeah, sure, you're going to take advantage of that 50-year loan. I mean, why not, right? Why not? And you're going to probably make out like a bandit. But if you're one of these people that really has no choice, you can't afford a basic house without getting a 50-year mortgage, you're going to be one of these people that are in the situation that I'm talking about, where you're just forced yourself into a permanent state of slavery. That's usury. I'm sorry, but that's usury. Our money, the way we do our money, because the government doesn't have any real limits to it, our money is a usury system. And if it's not in and of itself a usury system, it tends towards a usury system, a systemic usury of the poor, basically. And it's the poor that feel the benefit or the pain first, right? It's the poor that feel it first, and then over time, as the currency gets more and more debased, it goes into the lower middle class, then it goes to the middle class, then it goes to the upper middle class, and before you know it, everybody's in this kind of a situation. It is untenable, and I don't think God's pleased with it, and I don't think God sits on his hands for very long. He's a very patient God, but God will do something about this, and it's not going to be pretty. I think a better idea would be to stop it in its tracks right now. That would still cause pain, but it would be better than having God come in and do something about it. Because when God does something about it, just look at the Old Testament, the times where he judges Israel for this kind of stuff. It's usually not pretty. And I think that is going to happen at some point. That's my belief. In any case, hope you found this video helpful. God bless.